Well, sitting here at a beachside cafe underneath the palm trees, Jeff Lemon and former England fast bowler Stephen Finn, and goodness me, it didn't look initially like the Super 8s were going to have the drama that they did, but at the end of all that, Jeff, Australia remarkably out of the competition and a semi-final place for Afghanistan.
Well, the lesson for us that we didn't learn properly through the pool stage was not to make assumptions based on form or based on rankings, because we saw a number of upsets, but a lot of teams challenged by teams that you wouldn't have expected to be able to push them that hard. And the same thing happened in the Super 8s. Afghanistan getting over Australia was something that seemed like a surprise at the time, but they ran Australia so close, and the previous two times they've met in World Cups, both of those previous games could easily have been won by Afghanistan and perhaps should have been. Certainly the 50 over World Cup came last year. So they've had an ability to not be intimidated playing Australia the last couple of times they've done it, and they got them in the right circumstances, got conditions that worked, had the opening partnership came off with the bat, and that was enough. And that Australian team looked pretty lethargic and fairly spent by the time they showed up to try to bowl against India at 10:30 in the morning, sort of 30 hours later.
Finney, it's an amazing thing, isn't it, that we were talking about Australia dominating England, Josh Hazlewood in his press conference talking about how Australia could potentially play in a way that would get England out of the tournament, and the Aussies are out. It's such a strange turn of events in a way.
Well, it is, but I've been consistent all the way through that if you come flying out the blocks in the first couple of games, it's hard to maintain that. It's only really India that have managed to do that all the way through the tournament with the dominance that they've shown in every game. So yeah, I mean, I'm just very happy that Afghanistan have made it through to the semi-finals. I think they really deserve to be playing a knockout game of cricket, given how well they've competed in the last couple of World Cups, both 50 over and T20. And now they get their opportunity against South Africa, who are famously not that great in semi-finals, to try and make it to their first ever world final.
They did their best to make it nervy, Afghanistan. Talk us through that game against Bangladesh, Jeff.
Well, I mean, Stephen's talking about knockout games. They've had two knockout games back-to-back already, basically. They had to beat Australia to stay in the group, and they had to beat Bangladesh to go through, and they very nearly managed to not do that. It was weirdly that opening partnership again, which has been one of their strengths, but Gurbaz and Ibrahim Zadran just seemed spooked by the occasion. They were going along so slowly. It was at 5 and over through much of the innings. Rashid Khan comes out at the end and hits 3 sixes in the space of about 13 deliveries, and that's the key. That gets them to a mighty 115. They might have been on 90 had he not come out and had that sort of intervention. It was extraordinary how important it was, and that they'd allowed themselves to get into that position where they should have lost that game. The way the speed that the opening partnership went at, then wickets start to fall. Nobody seems willing to take the game on until Rashid Khan does it, and without that, they're no chance in that game. Bangladesh could have qualified if they'd run it down in 12 overs, so that was the early point of interest. Was okay, about 10 and over. If you can do that, if you can get 116 from a dozen overs, and they were giving it a shot. They took 13 off the first over. Lytton Das was taking it on, but a wicket started to fall in the second, and away it went. Naveen ul-Haq was terrific again, took 3 early, and suddenly Bangladesh were on the back foot. They gave up any hope of winning it in the 12 overs, but they were just trying to win it in the 20 overs, and should have done it. Were on track to do it. Lytton Das carries his bat, which is very rare in T20 cricket, and that indicates that everyone else got out. So they got bowled out about 10 runs short in the end, and with not quite an over to spare, it was reduced by rain to 19 overs at one point and took a couple of runs off the total. So the fact that Bangladesh couldn't get there tells you why they didn't deserve to qualify for the semis, but Afghanistan almost managed to not qualify themselves.
Finney, it included one of my favourite moments of the tournament last night. Talk us through Jonathan Trott waving towards Gulbuddin Naib, who then suddenly developed the most appalling hamstring injury.
Yeah, it looked like pretty bad cramp, that, didn't it, from Gulbuddin there. It was. I don't think he's going to win any Oscars for his acting, but it was funny that the cameras picked both incidents up. Jonathan Trott, he's remained relatively calm on the sidelines throughout this tournament, but he was a bit more animated there in desperation to try and slow play down. I'm not sure he quite meant throw yourself on the floor like a centre forward in the box in the Premier League, but yeah, it was an entertaining moment. There were a couple of moments there as well when Rashid Khan wanted to come back for 2 and then threw his bat at his batting partner when he refused the second, and then had to jog back to the non-striker's end without his bat and put his foot in the crease. So yeah, it's always an entertaining watch when Afghanistan play, and that tension and pressure, you could tell it meant so much to them to get through to the next stage. And yeah, it's just a really charming moment, I think, in cricket history.
The cameras were on. Jonathan Trott throughout. He was the most animated he's ever been. It wasn't just the slowdown. So at that point, they were, I think, 2 runs ahead on Duckworth-Lewis, and rain was coming in, so he wanted to make sure another ball wasn't bowled before it rained. But there was a slog sweep for 4 at one point where he's down on his knees behind the LED boards with his head in his hands. He was shouting things to himself. He was doing a Justin Langer and kicking the bins over. He was absolutely up and about. He was pacing up and down the boundary line. He's not a good watcher of cricket, Trotty.
We'll get on to the other semi-final, England against India, shortly, but Afghanistan against South Africa. It's an intriguing contest, this, isn't it? And I don't really know who's favourites, because you try and divorce yourself from the history of South Africa in semi-finals, sure. But equally, they got through an awkward game where it looked as though against West Indies, essentially a knockout match, where they could trip up, and Marco Jansen got them over the line.
Well, I don't think you can divorce yourself from the history of South Africa in semi-finals, because yes, they got through a must-win game, but here's another one. It's always been the semi-final stage, and as much as players can say, well, it wasn't us playing in 1999, but probably most of them weren't born then. The history is there. People talk to you about it. You can't help but be aware of it if you're one of those players. I'm sure that this is finally their chance to go through to a final, and then they'll come up against a team in Afghanistan that can take you to the mat and make it a real grinding sort of contest in the way they were able to do against Australia and the way they ultimately managed to do against Bangladesh.
Who do you think's favourites for this game, this semi-final?
South Africa have to be. They've been my pick since the beginning of the tournament, and I think they're due to win a world tournament at some stage. They will in their history.
We keep saying this.
We do, and they're going to have to divorce themselves from the hoodoo of missing out in semi-finals. But this is a great opportunity for them to get over that hurdle. I think the way that they negotiated those last couple of overs with Jansen and Rabada, ideally it wouldn't have been left to them, but ultimately it was. But they showed the calmness, 2 young men, to get South Africa through, and I think that's that influx of younger players that might help South Africa get over the line, albeit there would be something beautiful about Afghanistan playing in a World Cup final.
That first semi-final in the evening local time in Trinidad gets underway UK time at 1:30 in the morning. So Trinidad, the location, a night game, Jeff. In terms of conditions, where do we think that sits with these two sides?
Well, we just don't know much about it, do we? In terms of the surface, they might end up on the fact that it's evening has tended to make batting a little bit easier at times. We've tended to see our better run chasers in the evening when maybe the ball's skidding on a bit and it's not holding up in the pitch in the way that it has seemed to do in the day games when it's so humid and there's moisture everywhere, it's evaporating out of the ground, and there's that kind of stickiness. It seems like that it's been difficult for players to time shots, so that might free things up a bit, and then if South Africa can get going with especially the form that Quinton de Kock's been in, even on those slower pitches, then that could end the game within the first 5 or 6 overs if he's able to get away. But if it is still that more difficult kind of surface of the kind that we saw in St Vincent, I think that brings Afghanistan right into the game. South Africa have been nervy as hell chasing small totals throughout this tournament. They've batted poorly in most of their games. They've been dug out of a lot of holes by David Miller, and then de Kock finally has got going in his last couple of starts. So I'm not at all convinced by South Africa's batting. They so nearly coughed up that game to West Indies the other night when they had no business losing that, and they nearly managed to find a way to do it. So if there is a way to lose a game, they'll be the team to figure it out.
It was an extraordinary game, that West Indies match. We were watching in the hotel bar, and slowly but surely every member of staff started crowding around the television as South African wickets were falling. It was getting busier and noisier, and they just about got over the line. I don't know where that leaves them in terms of confidence, because they feel like a side, South Africa, that you've been calling it all along, Finney. They look so good on paper. They've got the likes of Heinrich Klaas, and they should be one of the best teams of the tournament. Yet they've sort of stumbled their way to an unbeaten record. It's been weird.
Yeah, it's not quite the dominating unbeaten record that we've seen India fly through the group stage and the Super 8 stage with, is it? So, look, you do feel as though they're due to put on a perfect game of cricket at some stage as well. They've managed to just, as you say, scrape over the line and do it the hard way up until this point. You do just feel at some stage they're going to put that game together where Klaasen goes mad, Rabada takes the new ball and nicks the 2 opening batters off, and Shamsi comes in with his wrist spin through the middle order and bamboozles people. You just feel as though that's round the corner, and they need to steel their minds and get ready to try and do that in 2 more games in this tournament.
Right then, what about the other semi-final? India have looked like the team, haven't they? They were absolutely outstanding in St. Lucia against Australia. And that game, it felt like a wounded side that wanted something to prove after that World Cup final in the 50-over format.
Yeah, and it felt like a side up against an Australian team that just weren't at the races. They got intimidated by how hot Rohit Sharma came out of the blocks at them. It was extraordinary how he was able to put Australia in this state of confusion so quickly, take down Stark early, 34 runs off Stark's first 2 overs. Hazelwood wasn't giving away a run at the other end, but it didn't matter because of the speed that scoring was at, and that was another game that felt like it was over after about 6 overs of that. You thought, well, it's going to be pretty unlikely that Australia will be able to come back from that. They gave it a decent shake in the chase. Travis Head had another of his good days, but not quite good enough to overturn such a big deficit. So, yeah, they look $1 million, but they're a team that has been knocked over by England when India have been looking good before. You've got a very organised sort of T20 outfit in that English team. Their experience, I think that the way England's been going in with their setup, their batting is a bit light, and I think that might be a problem for them if India are able to get away powerfully. But again, we're probably not expecting a really high-scoring game in Guyana, based on what we've seen there previously in the tournament. So that means it comes down to the freak-level players who are able to get their timing when others can't. And Rohit Sharma is one of those. He makes test hundreds on pitches where everybody else is falling in a heap. And he batted so well on that pitch in St. Lucia where most other players found it hard to really get going. And someone like Suryakumar Yadav who's able to find timing and manufacture shots that other players cannot.
The TMS Podcast
on BBC Sounds.
India are an intimidating team. I mean, England will be confident because they're finding a little bit of rhythm themselves, but India are some outfit, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, but I think both teams will probably be looking back to that semi-final in Adelaide in 2022, where England absolutely steamrolled India and they faltered under the pressure. India faltered in the final under pressure in the 50-over World Cup before Christmas. So it's absolutely not a foregone conclusion that India have looked so dominant to this stage that they're just going to continue doing so. I'd say on the flip side of that, Rohit Sharma looks as though he's on a vengeance mission to single-handedly drag his team to a World Cup win. But England will know that there's some degree of fragility there from India because of their memories in the not-too-distant past, and that's something that England, with some of the characters that they've got in their team, won't be scared. And that's where playing in the IPL and being in amongst these Indian players, I think, deflates the aura around them just slightly because you're in amongst them every day and they're not put on a pedestal like they are to maybe most other people.
I wonder if this is actually a really good setup for India, because this is about the lowest pressure kind of situation you could think of to play a semi-final. They'll be so off Broadway. They'll be in Guyana. Like, yes, it'll be played at a time that works for time zones in India, but they're as far away as possible, other side of the world. There probably won't be a huge crowd coming in. You can imagine some Indian supporters from the USA making their way over, or from the UK, that sort of thing. But it's not going to be a natural, easy trip for people to pop over there in the same way it might be in some of the other islands. So in a lot of ways there is always so much pressure on India to do well, and that is probably part of why they haven't in the past, but they can almost have a free swing at this because they're so far removed from the normal intensity of that environment.
We'll get on to England in just a moment. What of the schedule? There have been a few ructions about the fact that there isn't a reserve day for the Guyana semi-final. There is for the Trinidad semi-final, and that is worth pointing out that the regulations state there are 250 minutes that can be made up for both of the semi-finals. It just happens to be that the Trinidad game being a night game, those 250 minutes take place the next day. Because it is a day game in Guyana, and the 250 minutes happen on the same day. Hence, no reserve day, but equal amounts of time. Clearly, though, there is a fundamental flaw in that, in that a weather system and a pitch drying out can happen a lot easier overnight in terms of moving things on than it can on the same day.
Well, you've got 250 extra game minutes, but you've got 10 extra hours or 11 extra hours overnight before you start using up those minutes. So it is disingenuous to say that that the setup is identical. It isn't, clearly. Whether they should have put in another day, the only option would have been to have an extra day before the final to enable you to have a reserve day for the semi, and then you'd have situations where people would be saying that the team that got to play the first one had a much bigger advantage because they got 2 extra days off, and that wasn't fair. There'll always be ways to claim that something isn't fair, but trying to put these tournaments together is logistically horrendous. And there's also just the value of time. Every cricket team has different tours that they're on. They have demands on their players. There are 365 days in a year, and getting this tournament done as quickly as possible is something that the ICC need to do in order to get the buy-in from the teams. And so every extra day that you put in is an extra day that the big teams can't be making money somewhere else.
What do you make of how it's all shaken down, the schedule at the back end of this tournament?
I don't think there's a perfect solution to anything, really, to be honest. It's not ideal that there's not a rain day for each semi-final. I don't know whether there would ever be a possibility of having them both on the same day, and they'll have a morning game and an evening game, and then have the reserve day for both games in different locations. Then that panders to the Indian TV audience at both ends of the day and allows both teams the same amount of days off is probably the only logical solution around that. But look, nothing's been perfect in this World Cup. The weather's not been perfect, the surfaces haven't been perfect, but there have been so many charming stories throughout it that there's been enough entertainment for us to keep talking about, and I think that we've probably still got 3 more games of twists and turns to come.
The only thing we knew for sure was India were going to play in Guyana in their semi-final. Reason being, and this is from the ICC, that with high fan demand for India matches, the allocation of the semi-final and broadcast scheduling will allow as many people to watch that game as is possible.
I think it's a precedent that, well, it has some hairs on it. If the rationale is that you have to play the game, if they're going to frame it in equity terms and say to be fairest, you have to show it to the largest number of people, that's always going to be the TV audience in India. And so the logical extension of that is that every tournament from now on, no matter where it is in the world, has to have its final played at what will be prime time in India, which is a ludicrous concept, because you're supposed to play tournaments in the place that they're in. That's the point. You go to the place you're in, you figure out the times of day that will be best to play for that physical location, for that geography, for those weather systems, all the rest of it. Culturally, you're supposed to put on an event for the people who can come to the ground to watch it first and foremost. That's when a final should be held. I mean, the fact that you've got these knockout games, some of them being held at 10 o'clock in the morning, is just absurd. That goes against everything. All of the sales pitch for T20 cricket is that it's an evening game that families can come to and that people can come to after work, and all of those kind of lines that you get fed about why T20 cricket is the future. So this undermines that, and it sets up a bad precedent for future tournaments.
So what of England? Then they've had a funny old tournament, Finney. The defeat against Australia signalled alarm bells, scraped through the group stages with weather concerns, and the Scotland performances as well that jeopardised their place in the Super 8s. Defeat against South Africa, but they're through, they're into the semi-finals, and at times in this tournament they've looked really good. Yeah,
they have. They've been dominating in their wins. I think actually they've stumbled upon their best 11 of the players that they've got at their disposal here. I think the idea of having that top 4 of guys who are all used to opening the batting didn't work in those first few games. And even though I do feel as though Will Jacks deserves an opportunity in an England shirt for the way that he's played, I think it was the right decision to only have 3 of those guys in the team to enable the extra depth in the middle order, left-hand, right-hand hitting, and another bowling option in Sam Curran, who's come into the team. So yeah, I definitely feel as though England are just about hitting their straps at the right time. There wasn't too much panic or alarm after that South Africa defeat, even though it did leave England needing their net run rate in order to get through to the next stage of the tournament. But they've been here before, a very similar group of players with a few extra added youthful players in there, have been in this position in a World Cup semi-final against India before, and I think that they'll draw upon all of that experience to help them when it comes to playing that semi-final in a couple of days' time.
They've relied on that top 4, that set up with Salt, Butler, Bairstow and Brook, and it's come off most of the games. Harry Brook almost wins the South Africa game on his own as well, just about, with Liam Livingstone chipping in there. My concern is that chipping in chunk of the England batting lineup when you've got Moeen, Livingstone, Curran. I don't quite buy that as being a proper top 7. They're all players who I think can contribute and can have great days now and then. But if I'm leading a bowling side against that lineup, I feel like once I've got England 4 down, I'm very well positioned at that point. And it's a bit different when they've got Jordan, because that makes it a little stronger at 8, but they've had Archer coming in at 8, and it just feels like a fragile batting setup to me.
Do you think England go into this semi-final as underdogs, Vinny?
Not necessarily, no, because they've won world tournaments in the more recent past than India have, and there's a lot to be said for that, being able to deliver performances under pressure. That semi-final in 2022, I think everyone anticipated and thought that India would come and almost blow England away, but they didn't. England did the complete opposite to them. So look, they've got some guys who are very good under pressure. They're well led by Joss Buttler, batting at the top of the order and captaining. So I don't think England will be overawed or see themselves as underdogs going into this game, even though I'd imagine a lot of people around the world will look at the way that India have played throughout this tournament and believe that to be the case.
Right then, just finally, who are your finalists? We know our semi-finalists. Who's making it through, Jeff?
I'm going India, Afghanistan. I reckon, well, look, the Afghanistan one could go either way. They might just be overawed and get blown out of the water. But you've got to back the hot hand. They've managed to get through despite a pretty dismal performance against Bangladesh. They can take a breath now, take a beat, and then say, okay, well, we've got nothing to lose. We might as well throw ourselves into this. And I just feel like South African nerves could come into it. And India should win through. I think they won't get too nervous about their semi-final, but they might get nervous once they reach the final.
Finny?
I'm going to go the complete opposite. I think England and South Africa are going to make the final. I just think India are due a slip up. I don't think you fly through a tournament winning every single game. We saw that 50 over World Cup. I just can't see someone being so dominant in every single game. So it would be apt and timely for that slip up to happen in the semi-final for India and help England get through to that final. And then I do think South Africa, I think against a stronger team, I would have South Africa or a team that's been there before, like an Australia or something. I'd have them to beat South Africa in this semi-final, but I do have a feeling that this is South Africa's time, and I see them having too much for Afghanistan, who will also be under a significant amount of nervous energy and pressure coming into their semi-final with South Africa.
We will have to wait and see. Coverage of the first semi-final between Afghanistan and South Africa from Trinidad gets underway at 1:15 in the morning, in the early hours of Thursday. And then the game between England and India in Guyana. Our coverage will be underway from 3:15 on 5 Sports Extra and BBC Sounds. Promises to be thrilling. Who knows what twists and turns await in the semi-finals of this men's T20 World Cup.